The purpose of tonight is to share general information about the college process, and then the junior conference is the time for the individual discussion about the student's desire to go to college and what may be the best fit. There's no doubt that the process can be stressful, but I think it is important to remember that the end goal is for the student to end up in, as I said, a school that is the best fit for them. You're in very good, experienced hands in this process. There will be a lot of information shared tonight, but do not worry. We'll take you all through this step by step. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Mrs. Coolbear and Mrs. Slate.
Awesome, thank you, Mr. Henderson. So, without further ado, I think we'll just dive right in. We have a lot of content for you, as Mr. Henderson identified, and speaking both to the just post-secondary and post-Chatham planning, essentially. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking through tonight, we're going to talk about a junior conference, which is coming up, and something that we find to be very important in the counseling office, and a great opportunity for you to have very specific. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about here is very generalized, right? You all have very specific needs. You have a lot of those different things and nuances that we want to talk with you on a one-on-one basis, and our counselors do a really excellent job doing that with parents and guardians and the student in those designated conferences. We will talk about some post-Chatham pathways, so other options that are available to students, and largely we will be talking about the college application process because there are a lot of procedures and elements to that, but we are going to discuss a couple different CHS pathways as well. We're going to talk about some Chatham-specific college placement trends that might help you in terms of kind of forecasting, as well as some admission trends, using our Naviance tool, building a list, all that really fun stuff. And then just some to-dos, upcoming events, and resources.
Okay, so we are about to kick off our junior conference program starting next week, the week of January 9th. And these conferences will run from that time frame through to April. There is no rush to get on your individual school counselor's calendar in the immediate time frame. This part of the process takes time, and you have the time. So I want to reassure you of that. Your students have received messages from us on Schoology, which remind them that the conferences are starting and the instructions for prompting you to go on to the parent portal and schedule those conferences at times that are convenient for both your child's schedule and your work schedule. And in addition to that, you will also receive an email from your respective counselor in advance of your meeting time with some additional information that both you and your child should read through. It's highly informative, and there'll be some other things that we'll speak to that need to be completed prior to that meeting in order for it to be a productive conversation. To go into the portal, you will go into the conferences tab, and you will select to schedule a conference. There will be a series of dates with availability from each of your counselors to select a time and then mark your calendar for that date and time. And like I said, you'll get an email in advance of your meeting date. The portal is open, and it will remain open for a period of time for another few weeks through into February. And then we will close it out so that your appointments are set and we can move forward. Okay, so goals and objectives for our conference is the discussion of the overall post-CHS plan. That is very unique and specific to each individual student. No two students' goals and plans for after high school are exactly the same. So that's where the conference will get very personalized. You'll receive a lot of information, but it will be tailored to your child's goals and needs. We will review the progress to date. We will go over the transcript and share how the transcript is part of the process and different time frames in which the transcript will be released to colleges, which will be down the road in the senior conference as well. We will go over all the supplementary materials that will be part of the application. And not that the application process starts now, but there are a lot of things within the junior year time frame that we will be sharing with you to help you get ready for that process and get those materials prepared so that they're in place when the time comes. We will spend time talking about standardized testing. So many colleges are now test optional. Mrs. Slate will be speaking more detail to this in a future slide, but we will certainly touch on this topic and talk about taking the test and whether or not a certain test is the right fit for you and how to determine that. We will speak to Naviance and many aspects of that and how you can utilize Naviance in your search, as well as the scattergram data, which can help you to determine how to build a healthy list and what schools will be targets, likelies, and in the selective reach category as well. And then we will also talk about the financial aid timeline and how that will play out in the process. Okay, so in preparing for the conference, you need to begin to think about what your plans are for after high school. And that doesn't mean specific, I've got it all figured out, okay? That means just to get the wheels turning in your head, thinking about what you think you might like to do, what you might like to study, what type of environment you want to be in terms of an academic setting, how you learn, what your goals and interests are extracurricularly, all of those things. And part of that is tied into the game plan, which is the one item that we need everybody to complete prior to their conference. Students also will be receiving messages on Schoology from us reminding them to complete the game plan. That will also be itemized in the email that you receive in advance of your conference. That survey has the students give us very valuable information that will help us in advance of the meeting to know what some of those goals are that you're thinking about, and so that we can do our job in tailoring the meeting to those goals. And then in Naviance, there is a section called Colleges I'm Thinking About, keyword thinking about. There is also another section called Colleges I'm Applying to. That will come later in the senior conference. And you will have an opportunity to move schools that you did consider in the research process over into colleges I'm applying to. But right now, it's colleges I'm thinking about, or schools that I'm thinking about, and this could be very preliminary. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to apply to these schools at this time. It's the ones that you are thinking about and researching. You can edit this list at any time, take schools off, add more on. So to get a preliminary list going is also helpful in terms of us tailoring the meeting to your needs. And then if by chance you have taken some standardized tests, you can share those scores with us in Naviance so that we have that preliminary data. That doesn't mean go rush to sign up for a test now if you don't have test data in the bank. There is plenty of opportunity, and we're going to be speaking to the testing timeline in a future slide as well. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Slate to talk about some additional CHS pathways.
So as far as the options after Chatham, we want to identify kind of a menu of options, which we'll be going through in our next slide. So essentially, your path is really what is best for you. We say a lot to our students very similar things. If you go to Magic Fountain, you're not ordering the same ice cream as your friends. If you're going to the mall, you're not you're not buying the same size pants or even the same brand pants as your friends, right? Like, there are things that are going to fit you specifically, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about tonight, is about fit and finding those things that really work for you. It's hard to sometimes, remove the static that we hear all the time. A lot of seniors are talking about that right now, and we understand that, but we really want to try our best to, reiterate that. So when we talk about the options that are available to students, we like to kind of think about them as a menu of options, right? So we've categorized those into some educational options and then some personal/service options. So we have the a county college option in 2+2, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, as well as vocational technical school. So all ways to further your education in various different ways, meeting various different needs, and basically different end goals. We're kind of trying to think of what is your big end goal and how do we take the steps to meet those end goals. And additionally, in terms of a service and personal, military, ROTC is a college and educational pursuit. That's an option too, which we can talk about in more one-on-one conversations, junior conference, if you will, gap years and employment. We're going to talk about all of these in a bit more depth. The $2.55 is just because of 255 Lafayette. Everything basically is the same price, right? Because all of these things are all the same kind of value, right? It really is just what works best for you. So first thing we do want to identify are the two college options, right? So we have one pocket of the bachelor's degree institutions. That's what we hear a lot of our students talking about. Oftentimes they're called four-year schools. We try to shy away from that language because some of you, parents may be shaking their heads like, it doesn't always take 4 years to finish certain programs, right? So we try to shy away from the four-year school label, and really these are just bachelor degrees institutions. Rutgers, Seton Hall, UCLA, all these different types of schools out there. There are differences. There are colleges versus universities. Usually the difference between that has to do with size of the school, maybe research opportunities, things along those lines. One does not dictate one is better than the other, but it's just kind of a semantic situation in terms of the college versus university. There are public and private schools, right? So Rutgers is our example of our state kind of flagship public school. There are plenty of other public schools in the state, but Rutgers has a lot of state funding. You maybe get more state funding to attend that school. And then there's private schools like Seton Hall, which are privately funded. They usually have larger endowments. They have more alumni, maybe donors, things along those lines. So there are the differences between the two. Oftentimes, one of the things we hear the most, and we heard a lot this past fall in talking with seniors, is private schools are more expensive than public schools, so it's always better to go to public school. That's a big sticker price, right? And that's something we'll talk about senior year. That doesn't necessarily mean to be the case, right? So private schools might have more individual money that they can give to students rather than public school, which brings that overall cost down. So don't let what they call a sticker price at a private school deter you from looking at one. They just offer maybe different services, sizes of the schools may be different, it really does depend. And then we have, for the schools, they have specific admission requirements, right? This is not an open enrollment, which is the contrary, the associate's degree institutions. You have to meet certain benchmarks, there's certain acceptance rates, all that kind of stuff we're gonna dive into in just a little bit. So, for the associate's degree institutions, we are super lucky to have one of, pretty much notably across the, sometimes even country, even one of the best county colleges in the country, including the state in particular. There are so many resources, and it is a great option for students who, for a slew of reasons, not just for cost, we have some benefits on here. Cost tends to be one of the bigger reasons, but there's a lot of flexibility with this. There's a lot of opportunities for students to mature academically and maybe better suit themselves if they want to apply to a bachelor's degree institution down the line. So there are a lot of really benefits to this. One thing we talk about a lot is the 2+2 program. So a lot of students can take advantage of 2 years at community college. They end with that associate's degree at a very, I might say, it's a little bit small here, at a very significantly lower cost. So about $3,000 to attend, for 1 year versus an in-state about $21,000. These prices might have changed as well because we know inflation and all that good stuff. And then you transfer to the 2 years, let's say to Rutgers, that bachelor's degree institution, and you end up with your four-year bachelor's degree. It says from Rutgers University, right? It doesn't say you did 2 years here and there's an asterisk and things along those lines. So for a slew of reasons, there's a lot of great opportunity for the county college options, and that is an open enrollment, right? So they are basically committed to having an equitable opportunity for all students to be academically successful. You have to maintain a certain GPA once you're there. It can't just be anyone who wants to go, right? But in terms of access and equitability, or being equitable, I should say, everyone has that open enrollment, which is the major difference as well. Okay, so those are the two college pieces. Again, we will be going back to those bachelor's degree institutions because, as we said in the beginning, that is a large portion of the specifics and nuances of this conversation, and we recognize that there are a good amount of people in the audience that likely are here for that information. But again, that's why we address all of the areas and why we have these junior conferences, so we can talk more in depth about some of these options. So vocational trade school is a great option for students who maybe are the people who are not enjoying sitting in class all day, they're not enjoying the 8 to 3 situation, right? They want to be working with their hands, they want to be active, and they still want to continue their education, but they want to be doing something that, again, is a bit more active and maybe not as long-term from the education standpoint. A lot of really promising fields exist in this. There's a lot of vocational jobs in healthcare, computer and tech. There's nursing, cosmetology, auto technician, a lot of things along those lines. So a lot of students this is a great option for students who really want that practical training and want to be doing something a little bit different from that traditional kind of bachelor's degree grant institution. Gap year or employment is also an option, right? So if maybe you're a student who you've been really going, and you're looking for an opportunity and you're realizing, I'm not totally sure what I want to be doing. Do I want to dive right into a college path? Do I want to dive into the military or things along those lines? You might want to take a breather for a slew of reasons. Sometimes students, when they think gap year, they think this means, Ms. Colbert will probably agree, they think this means it's like chilling and watching Netflix, which is of course not the case. We want to talk with you, and we have resources of different gap years that are out there. Some students might be going on service trips. Some students might be going internationally to learn. Some students might be taking a 1 semester equivalent or just a couple months or things along those lines. Maybe they're taking 1 or 2 classes, or they're working in order to get some money and get some real cash flow in order to then go through what their next path may be. So this can be a great option. We saw a lot more students, excuse me, a lot more students over the past couple years, especially with COVID, causing students to kind of pause and take a look at all these things and really kind of reassess, where am I at my maturity level academically, personally, and socially? Am I ready to make what is a big decision, right, at the age of 16, 17, 18? And then the last 2 we have here are military and apprenticeship. So military, of course, if you're interested in serving your country, that is a very noble thing, and we are super thankful for people who do that, but it is a big conversation, right? So it's something we want to talk with your school counselor, your parents and guardians, all those types of things, right? But those are our options available to you, and there are other pathways rather than just enlisting right from high school. There's other ways to go through that. And then the apprenticeship. It's a skilled occupation kind of job where essentially it's almost like an internship, but you're on the job learning, and similar to a vocational trade, but you're actually learning kind of as you're going rather than maybe being in that classroom and doing the traditional, the pathway of schooling. So a lot of different options out there, and we are always really, really happy to kind of talk through those options with you.
I'll just highlight real quick here before Mrs. Slate continues with college placement trends. You could just go back to the previous slide for me. This was an overview of the different, alternative pathways, and none of these preclude a student from pursuing, additional post-secondary education. Some of these experiences are highly valuable at paving the way for a very productive and successful post-secondary education. It sometimes helps students determine what they want to do in a more passionate way, a more validating way for themselves. It may open more doors for them to explore their interests further and get some hands-on experience in their field of interest, or like I said, identifying a field of interest if they do not know. So this is something that is very real, very much positively viewed. We're seeing more and more students take advantage of these types of options. So it's okay if you don't know what you want to do, or if you're not necessarily thinking that college is the very next step after high school. It's still always out there waiting for you.
Thank you, that's a great thing to add. So we're going to kind of shift gears to kind of the college conversation. Again, a pretty nuanced process, and we want to really address the nuances of that, but at the same time not kind of overwhelming, right? It is only January. It's January 4th, right? This is very early. Juniors are like, I just became juniors, right? But we want to get you this information early now so you're becoming a bit familiar with it, and then the more you hear it, the more you digest it, the more comfortable you are with it before we end up hitting that summer, which we know comes pretty quickly. Like today, it's 60 degrees, so it already feels like spring. So we know that moves fast, and that's why we're giving that information. But additionally, we just like to show we think some data points are helpful. We think sometimes numbers don't lie, right? It's helpful just to kind of see some different data points that we're seeing over the past couple of years. So in terms of Chatham students' plans over the past couple of years, last year in particular, about 95% of our students did pursue those bachelor's degree institutions, or it's a mix. So bachelor's degree, they had the two distinguished there. So bachelor's degree institutions, we had about 2% approaching the associate's degree and 3% doing some other kind of option or pathway. And here's just a summary of the college application, kind of summary that we saw last year to give you an idea. of average about applications. I'm not going to read all these numbers out to you. We will share the slides so you can really look at them if you really want to. But just to give you an idea of kind of the overview of what we saw for overall applications, we processed quite a few applications at Chatham High School. They go up every year, but we know that's part of the trend, and we will speak to those trends in just a little bit. And we also like to point out here that this is all from the class of 2022. This is kind of a GPA distribution breakdown from the students and how their GPA applies, or their GPA and where they land in that. So we had a strong amount, the highest amount of our students fell within that 3 to 4.0 range. The point being, all of these students had excellent post-secondary options, and I think oftentimes we're hearing in the media, we hear from other peers that you have to have a 6.7 GPA in order to get into a school or to be successful or to be happy, right? And so we want to kind of bring the reality to light of that. That's not always the case, and that's not always the way it sometimes appears. You might be sitting next to your friend and they're getting 98s in all their tests, and you're like, I'm just getting B's or C's. It's not always the case in terms of what's kind of going on in the conversation. So the majority of our students are falling within that range, and they're not, the top of the top of the top, and still finding a lot of success in the post-secondary plans. So this one is basically talking about the college application success versus the number of applications they put out. So we really like to reiterate with this slide that intention is really important with your college process. So students that we see, we had students that applied, we'll talk about numbers of applications. We had a couple students, 26, quite a few, that applied to over 20 schools. And they saw, as you can see, the lower acceptance rate so they found kind of a bit of a less of success in terms of getting acceptances versus when we look at our 5 to 9, our 1 to 4s, they received a higher percentage of acceptances. And part of that reason we talk about is having this intentional search. They're identifying schools that are a good fit for them academically, admissively, all those things. So we really just kind of like to identify that there sometimes is a diminishing return, excuse me, on acceptance rates depending on how many you're throwing out there. Of course, there are some outliers that can skew some things, but we do see it in just anecdotally in working with students, even senior year now, students that are coming to us with some getting high fives and really excited are usually those students that are listening to kind of that advice in terms of what we're going to talk about in a little bit of identifying healthy range of schools, targets, likelies, reaches.
This is where, the saying goes, less is more. If you are really doing active research and thinking carefully about the list that you're developing, and you're making sure that it's a healthy one, and we'll define that a little bit more in a future slide, but if you're doing that, then those list of schools will be more of that match, target, fit category, and that's where that's going to produce, far more positive outcomes. Okay, so putting some things into perspective in the process, you really want to focus on what you can control. And I'll be talking a little bit more about the theme of telling your story and what it is that you want to come through in the application ultimately as you're doing your research and preparing for the process. But the fact of the matter is you control what you can control. There are parts to this process on the college side that are a business, essentially. And so once you put your best foot forward and maximize everything that you possibly can to present yourself in the best light to the institutions that you're applying to through your application, after that you need to let it go. And then it is in the hands of the review process, and there are certain things that certainly will be looked for behind the scenes on the institutional side, and you cannot control that. Also, try to put the blinders on a little bit. This is a highly individualized process. What is right for your peers and your friends may not necessarily be right for you. Your school list could be very, very different. Your pathways could be very different. It is very individualized, and your goals are unique to you. And I find that, and we find that when students compare notes too much with each other, that heightens the stress levels surrounding the process. There isn't a right or wrong. There isn't a black or white. It's all shades of gray, and it is what is a match and a fit for your goals for the future. So keep that in mind. And then in focusing on an intentional list, so you really need to do active research, and we're going to talk about what types of research that is in a little bit. But you really want to be thinking about what you want in a particular environment, and not just from the academic perspective, but the social emotional perspective, extracurricularly, where you think you're going to find your people and feel connected, so that ultimately where you land, it's going to be a place that you want to call home for the next 4 years, and it needs to feel right and comfortable. So developing a list of schools that you would be happy to go to any one of them once you have the outcomes in front of you. You should not be saying, next February, March, April, I don't want to go to any of my, target likely category schools. You want to like all of them on your list. That's where you can't control what the outcomes will be. So if you've done the active research up front, and then you have your choices in front of you, and you went into the process confident in your list, yeah, there may be a disappointment, discouragement here or there when maybe something doesn't go your way exactly. But if you've done the job right in building that intentional, healthy list that we're talking about, you will have choices that you will be happy with.
All right. So we want to identify some admission trends. I know we have some folks here that this is their kind of first time in the rodeo, but we have some people maybe that it's not their first time in the rodeo, but things have changed significantly over the past couple of years for a slew of reasons, right? So one of the first things we're going to talk to and speak to is the very increased number of applications that we see across the board, right? One of the big things when we went test optional, which was one of our bullet points when colleges went test optional, is that opened the gate for a lot of people who maybe previously were deterred by their testing scores to not apply to certain schools, and now they had this opportunity, which is actually really great, right? That is a great opportunity. We're going to talk about test optional and how tests shouldn't be the dictation of you as a person and your academic worth and all that good stuff. But it really inflated our application numbers, right? UCLA is one of the, take the top spot every year. They had almost 150 applications for like 6,700 spots. That is a lot of college applications. One example we like to see here, Auburn has become a really popular school for our students. And as of the 2021, they had about 40,000 plus apps. So they had a 68% increase. But from 2020, they had a 155% increase in applications. So we're seeing a really big change, right? And the reason we kind of point to Auburn is a lot of students for Auburn, if you're not familiar with the school, great school, was kind of a target likely for a lot of our students, and that has shifted a little bit, right? It's kind of a bit harder to point to that in some ways because of these things. So that is a trend that we all need to be aware of, we might already be aware of, but they are things that we kind of want to keep in mind when we're throwing our hat in the ring for some of our applications, and is again why we drill so often this conversation about an intentional list, quality over quantity, things along those lines. Because, better for worse, we kind of are feeding it, right? We're feeding this kind of process by continuing to apply to all these schools. We're not going to single-handedly fix that at Chatham High School. It's kind of a whole national, situation to kind of talk through, and higher ed officials are talking about that. But it is a big contribution to why we're seeing some pretty difficult decisions or harder to predict decisions. So that's kind of the big overarching. We're seeing changes as a result in acceptance rates and admission expectations. So again, what used to be maybe a target school comfortably might not be as much. And then we're seeing a lot of what colleges are calling yield protection. So without going too much into how the sausage gets made, every school wants to yield the students. They want to yield a class of a certain amount of students, right? In order to do that, you normally have to cast a very big net, right, to catch only a couple fish. So, for example, with UCLA, they had 150 apps. They didn't accept 6,700 students, right? I forget how many they did end up accepting, but they accepted probably double that amount in order to only yield 6,700 students, right? So a lot of colleges, that used to be very predictable for them. They knew students were applying to 3 or 4 or 5 schools. They knew their chances. They could do all the data, things that I don't, data-wise, really totally know how to predict, but they were able to do that. Now, because we see students who are applying to 22 schools and they can only choose one at the end, colleges can't predict that. They can't figure out, they can't read your mind like they kind of could a little bit before. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of students who are getting deferred in the process, and getting on a wait list. So we'll go more into, what seniors deferrals and wait lists, but just to give you a brief overview if you're not familiar, a deferral essentially is if you're applying in an early round. So we had a lot of students apply November 1st, they got their application in, they followed all the steps, they paid the money, always paid the money, right? But the colleges basically are saying, we're not ready to make a decision on you yet. We're not saying no, we're just gonna move you on over to the regular decision pool, which is really frustrating, understandably, and that goes back to colleges are businesses. They are trying to protect their yield. They don't wanna say no to you yet, but they don't totally know. One of those reasons they might wanna see senior year grades. They want to see how you compare to the regular decision applicants, right? So they're really kind of protecting themselves. So that's a really big thing with deferrals that we're seeing nowadays. Way more deferrals than ever before each year so far. But a deferral, and I try to reiterate to our students, is not a denial. A lot of colleges will just deny students out of that, but it is a yield kind of protection option, as well as wait lists. Wait lists are different than a deferral in that chances of getting off a wait list are very, very slim. Deferrals, your chance of getting off of a deferral, it isn't a list, right, is pretty good. Wait lists generally you don't find out until June, July if you're off that wait list. So again, it's them padding. Basically they're saying, usually May 1st is when seniors have to make a decision on where they're gonna go. So come May 2nd, if Mr. or Mrs. College head honcho said we didn't meet our yield, we're gonna now go to the wait list and try to see who we can get to meet that yield, right? And so that creates, again, it's the increased applications, it's the inability to read the minds like they used to be able to. But you might be hearing that term a little bit more. It's a bit more of a internal term, but I think it's an important one to be aware of, that colleges are doing this as kind of a strategy to protect themselves because they need the financial stimulation, right, to kind of get themselves going as well. And then I'm going to skip to the last one because I'm going to leave the bullet point for test optional a little bit more time. Qualitative review, because of the test optional piece, we're seeing more students are identifying not necessarily metrics, like admission metrics, like here's my SAT score, here's my GPA. Those are still important for certain pieces, but colleges also want to see how are you going to contribute to their college campus, right? Are you going to join a club? Are you going to be a bump on the log? Like, how are you going to do that? So we're seeing a lot of colleges wanting to see the personality piece a little bit more as well. Doesn't mean you need to hop on 50 clubs. You shouldn't be starting a club just for the sake of starting a club to say you can put it on your application, right? Something that's intentional. Basically, how are you spending your time outside of school? That you're doing something, right? It's not that you're just kind of going home and doing school. That doesn't necessarily work as much anymore. They want to see this full kind of qualitative picture. And then finally, I know this is a lot of information, but finally for test optional, we're going to talk about, we have a whole slide on test optional and kind of the merits and value of that, and I touched upon this a little bit in the beginning. But essentially really going test optional is what kind of drives a lot of yield protection, inability to maybe understand students and make certain admission decisions, deferrals and things along those lines. So ultimately this is a really good thing for students who are not strong test takers, and we'll go over that. But it does contribute to the difficulty sometimes in making decisions for admission officers, but we're seeing that it is not going anywhere, which again is really good from an equitable standpoint because we saw a lot of individuals who were able to get access to test prep, to things along those lines, were those individuals who were getting high test scores, right, versus maybe students who were in not areas where they're able to access those types of things. So test optional really, I think Ms. Coolbear mentioned it earlier, not going anywhere. We're going to see that continuing to rise. We have a piece on that on our slide on testing as well. Oh, and actually I should say sorry before I cut you off. And I put in the box here, how do we address these things? We manage our expectations, we go in with kind of a grain of salt on things, and we also open our mind to maybe other schools or other pathways that are not as common, but are just as excellent, right? And so that's what we try to do in the office too, is kind of open your mind to other schools. You like this school that 70 people are applying to, that you might also like this school, which is pretty similar. So those are some ways to kind of address those. I don't want to just say all these things and then be like, okay, figure it out, right? We're all kind of figuring it out together.
Okay, so even though you won't embark on the application side of the process till much later, the back end of the summer and into the fall, as you're doing the research phase of the process, running alongside that is the preparation for the application. And this is where telling your story comes in. You're going to be, students will be filling out what's called a brag sheet later in the spring, and that will be due back to us before the end of the school year. And that brag sheet will encompass a lot of what the telling your story factors are all about. What interests you? What coursework, subject areas, have been most rewarding or, positive for you? How have those experiences, both academically and then also extracurricularly or outside of school, molded and shaped your goals for the future? So you'll want to be reflective about your past 4 years. There are about 14 questions on this brag sheet in various categories, speaking both to academic, personal, social, family, hobbies, interests, traditions, experiences, and the like. So all of that will encompass telling your story. So you'll want to think about the coursework that you've taken. How has that maybe, evidenced a theme along the way? Not that that means you have to have it all figured out, like I said, or identified a specific field of study, but maybe generally what areas of interest you have most typically had each year. And as you get into junior and now senior year, your schedules are going to open up a lot more for you to have a freedom of choice to select electives, and that's where you can start to evidence some of those themes. Extracurricular activities, again, I want to emphasize that this doesn't mean volume. It doesn't mean run out and go fill in, the categories where you may not necessarily have done something. It's not about doing something in every single category. It's about a blend of a few things that you've been interested in, passionate about, and to which you then show continuity from there over time. So that, that kind of gives a sense of who you are, what you're about, and what your interests are. The test score, we've talked about that a few times now. All I'll say about that at this point is that, there are so many schools that are test optional, so you don't need to necessarily feel pressure to submit a test score in the application process. Your test scores do not define you. But we will encourage you in our conferences to consider taking a test and having some test data in the bank. This way you are prepared in the event that there is a school or two on your list that requires or strongly recommends a test score, or even for those schools that are test optional and your score is in the range that would be in that middle 50% accepted category, you may end up considering sending those scores to those schools specifically, even though they are test optional. The other component of telling your story will be letters of recommendation. You will all get one from your counselor. That is pretty standard in the process. There are schools that may require 1 teacher recommendation or 2 recommendations. Some even allow more than that. We recommend that each student solidify 2 teacher recommendations, and we'll speak more specifically to how that will play out in the application process once we know your final list. But the point here is to be thinking about who those teachers may be, teachers who know you well, teachers who have a sense of your style of learning, your motivation, your willingness to succeed regardless of challenges, self-advocacy, things like that. You can also think about teachers in areas where you may have struggled a little bit. That's actually a good thing to consider, especially if you've taken those steps to conquer those challenges you may have encountered in that subject area, because then the teacher can speak, to those skills. The essay, this is like another area where you can really bring your personal story forth, give a sense of who you are and what you're about. This is a way for you to maybe share other things that might not be reflected in your application. Some of the questions are very unique. On the Common App, there's about 7 or 8 different questions that students can choose from, one including being a topic of your choice. So there is a wide array of opportunity to tell your story, so to speak, through the essay. And it's an opportunity for you to bring your voice into the application. In terms of extracurriculars outside of clubs and other things that you might do within school, you can also speak to other experiences or accomplishments that you may be doing outside of school. I'm finding more and more through the brag sheet that I'm learning and we are learning that students do some really amazing things that might not be reflected here in the walls of the school building. So there may be a lot of hobbies, things that you do on your own time, and those are things that you want to share as well. And then finally, there may be an interview that might be held down the road with an admissions representative from a school of interest. It's not a required component of the application process. There are a fair amount of schools that will welcome a request and honor a request for one if you ask for it. So that's something that could be another piece that you could bring forth part of your story. And then depending on certain fields, things like art and more visual performing art areas, there might be a portfolio component. So lots of different things that tell your story here. So the next thing is determining fit. This is where the active research comes in when you are developing a preliminary list of schools. Certainly, Mrs. Slade spoke to public versus private. You also want to start to think about geographic location. How close or far away from home do you want to be? And particularly the size, small, medium, large, very large. Universities. Size is not always defined by the total population of students on campus. Size is also a feeling. And so, visiting the colleges is another great way to get a sense of that. Sometimes a larger school, because of the way they run things, can create a more intimate academic environment. I've had some other students go to small schools and visit them and tell me that they felt lost on that campus. So it's all a matter of preference and how the institutions, create a culture on their campus. And then field of study or program, I really highlight this. Again, prefacing that you don't need to know and have it all figured out. But if you are starting to think about a particular field of study or area of interest, or you do know what you want to consider for a career, I highly recommend actively researching programs at schools. Because there are certain schools that are, known for those particular programs, and it's important to keep that in consideration. And then, again, as I mentioned before, not just factoring all the, academics and geographics and size, but also the social emotional factors of a school. Can I see myself here? Will I find my people here? Are there things I like to do in and around the campus, and will I be happy, engaging in those things? It's a life experience, and you really need to think about the fit, not just the name of the school, but the school and what it has to offer you. Visiting is definitely, one of the key ways to do the active research, and we certainly recommend that. But we also know that traveling and going all over, the region and across the country to visit schools is really taxing on the schedule. We can't always fit that in within the time frame before the application is going to be submitted. So you can do some preliminary visiting right here in our backyard, and I highly recommend that as well, because you can get a sense of the size, the environment, what your preferences will be just by visiting schools in our local area. And then you can say, okay, I like these particular types of schools, and now I want to look at more of this type. And in your conferences, you can talk to your counselors about, well, what are some other schools beyond the walls of New Jersey that are similar in appeal to the schools that I've seen in the Jersey area. But if you can't visit, that's okay. But make sure you are doing some other form of research. Scour the website, look at the programs they have to offer, the extracurricular experiences, take the virtual tour, look at certain programs that might be offered to you at this particular institution that are not offered as another. Take a lot of good notes, because there's some schools that will have something called the supplemental question, which we'll speak more to in the senior presentation in our senior conferences. But a lot of the supplemental questions for certain schools is under the umbrella of why us? What is it about our school that appeals to you? And so this active research that you do on their website can give you a lot of verbiage and ammunition to answer that question.
I will speak to this. This has stuck with me when I was in admissions at Ithaca. a father came up to me one time and he said, you should tell everyone you talk to, one of the favorite things he did when he took his daughter on tours, and she obviously hated it, was after every single visit or during the visit, he would take pictures of her, like secretly, to see like how genuinely she was smiling, was she actually excited about it. These can blend together if you're going on a lot of this. So like you're saying, identify, take good notes, maybe take your own, like a note for each kind of school, really kind of to differentiate. All of these have a great dining hall food. All of these have study abroad. They all have student wellness centers, right? So you want to differentiate what those things do, because that can be really difficult when you're coming down to say, what was the difference between Bucknell's campus and Lafayette's campus, right? Or things like that. And I will also note too, demonstrated interest is a term you may hear as you're getting into the process a little bit. Generally, this helps colleges sometimes track. I compare this to students like with dating. So basically, they want to know how much of a crush you have on them, right? This only applies to a couple number of schools, but they want to know, if I ask this person out on a date, are they going to say yes to me? And I feel pretty confident they're going to say yes to my date because they've liked my Instagram posts, they've done all those types of things, right? So you've maybe gone to an online info session, you visited campus, you emailed an admission counselor, right? Some colleges, again, majority doesn't factor in for them at all, but some colleges do, and so it's always an appropriate question to ask, hey, real quick, in an email, while you're on a tour, do you track demonstrated interest? Because if they do, they can, like I say with students, like they can tell if you have a crush on them, vice versa, right? So sometimes that goes into the admission process, so that's something to keep in mind when you're going on tours. Also, a lot of people will sometimes drive through a campus, which is perfectly fine and great, but if that school tracks demonstrated interest, they didn't know that you were there, right? So it's always just a quick email to ask, phone call even, it will take you 5 seconds. I know phone is like, no for the younger generation, but you absolutely could just ask even before you go, right? Because you don't have to always do the 2-hour-long walking around in a group tour, right, to get an idea. Like Ms. Cool, what Bear mentioned, we were talking about the local, you have 45 minutes, you have Rutgers, you can see a huge campus, you can go down the street and you can see Drew, which is a small campus, you can go to Stevens, which is a city campus, right? So you can really do that window shopping right in our home state without needing to fly all the way to California or Texas or stuff to really see what like a big state school looks like, right? So definitely a lot of options there. Don't ever hesitate to ask things. They're there for that reason, admission counselors and the offices. They want questions, and they're probably always gonna say there's never a silly question, even though sometimes we know there are, but that's their job, is to help answer those questions for you. And asking if they track demonstrated interest is not a silly question.
And if they don't necessarily track interest or they're less public about whether or not they do, it can't hurt to establish a line of communication with admissions. So I encourage students all the time to reach out and ask questions and provide them with information, and that can only help, not hurt in the process.
Absolutely. So we're talking a big game about, fit's important, all these things are important, but how do you identify that and how do you go about doing that? We're gonna talk about some tools to help you with doing that, but also we're gonna first talk about what a healthy list really looks like for us in the counseling office. It looks like, again, it's individualized, but we like to categorize with 3 areas. You're gonna hear probably these terms, if you haven't already, you're gonna hear it a lot, likely, target, and reach schools. Likely is a school where your chances of getting into that school are very, very high. They're often called safety schools, but it's not our favorite term in the counseling office because as things change, nothing is ever super safe in the college admissions world, as scary as that is, right? But you meet basically most of the application criteria, you meet all of the application criteria. Your scores are above the middle 50%. Your GPA is on par or higher than that, right? Or actually not on par, it's higher than the average percentage. And we ask that you have, 1 to 2 schools in this category list. It depends on, each list is different, but just kind of when people ask us, what's the perfect number, right? That's kind of the number we've come up with. And the important thing that I get Mrs. Colbert is waiting to jump in on, you definitely can if I don't mention it well enough, is that you need to like your likely schools, right? We talked to a lot of seniors who are like, I got into this school, but I don't really like it. Why did you apply there? That took 30 to 40 minutes of your life, right? You need to like your likely schools. In the unlikely circumstance that you only get into your likely schools, right? We want to make sure that you're being intentional. Do you have anything to add to that? Because I know you always speak to that.
No, I think that you pretty much covered it, but in terms of building this healthy list, you want to obviously have the majority in the target range if you can. Where your schools academic profile is a match for yours. And it is pretty, solid that you will be strongly considered for admission these schools. And, in the likely school, you're going to slightly exceed, those admissions profiles, and that is really, really, more than solid that you're going to have an opportunity to be considered for admission. And then, of course, everybody has, one or two, maybe a few more in that reach selective category, but that's not where you want to put all of the energy. Because of the level of selectivity and the acceptance rates being a much narrower margin, it is much healthier to have the majority in the target and in the likely. I'll just say, openly, my daughter's first choice was her likely school. And that was because she actively researched the program at that school for what she wanted to study. And, so it's just really important to like every single school on your list.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the application of some of this. So we're not asking you to do this. You can make it on a Google Doc pretty easy. But we're pretending we identified 4 schools here, and then the gray box in the bottom is our students' demographics for just an ACT and a GPA. And so we identified these 3 schools, and using what we've been referring to as the middle 50% ranges of the schools, which I'll show you where you can find that information out in a little bit if you don't know already, we identified what those middle 50% were. So, UVM has their GPA average is 3.8, which is my GPA, right? And the ACT, yes, is a little bit higher, but they have a range. Maybe they accept lower, or I might go test optional, which they don't know. They're just going to look right at my GPA. So UVM, to me, is a target, especially because their acceptance rate is 64%. That's not high. That's selective for sure, but it's not highly selective, right? Versus, URI, I'm not going to go over every one of them. You can see that that's a likely school for us. Johns Hopkins and Villanova are our 2 reach examples here, and you can see that those GPAs are very, very different, right? ACT scores are very different, but the acceptance rates are vastly different. So while my GPA is 3.8 and Johns Hopkins average is 3.9, that tells a different story when you really get into the nitty-gritty, right? So you can't necessarily always use certain metrics and data points. You want to make sure you're kind of looking into those things. We'll talk about how to do that, but this is just an example of kind of how to really apply, for those number people out there, how to apply some numbers and statistics, and also manage expectations. You've heard us say this a bunch of times, but just, again, it's not a bad thing to have these 2 schools on my list. It's not a bad thing at all. It's just that I need to manage my expectations in the possibility of my admission there, right? So that's just kind of an example of that. So standardized tests, as we've been promising, right? So we are going to first talk about all the different we have the first general testing tips, but we're also going to talk about the test optional landscape. We've talked a lot about it, so we're not going to necessarily dive too deep into it. That summary of what we talked about earlier, right, is it's not going anywhere. As you can see from the metric, there's a website called fairtest.org, which basically is committed to this idea. They've been doing it for many, many years, that a student is way more than just a test score. So they're already predicting that 1,800 plus schools, so those bachelor's degree institutions, are going to be test optional for next fall, for this coming, it's already this fall, it's 2023. Of those schools, 1,700 are going to be optional, and then of those schools, about 80 plus are going to be test free, which is a bit of a newer term. So on the right for you all, left for you all, right for me, I broke down the different distinctions for you. So test optional, you have the option. Test free, the schools will not look at it. You could have gotten a perfect score on your SAT. You could have gotten 1,600. They will not look at it. It's a very small number, as you can see, only like 80 or so, but it's under 100 at this point. But there are schools that really just they don't think the SAT or ACT is an accurate estimate of who that student is, and they think there are equity issues with that, right? And so they are making sure that they just want to remove that metric from their admission process. Which leaves us with that question we talked about, the admission trends, right? Of, what do you look at, right? And that's where you're getting some of that qualitative information that students are looking at. You're seeing a lot of essays that Mrs. Colbert talked about, including supplemental essays, and looking at GPA and the strength of, what courses you're taking and how intentional you are with those courses throughout your time. And then we have a very, very small number that are test required. Very small number. That's like pretty faux pas these days. But there are like, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe 5, a handful, I don't know them off the top of my head at this point, but there are a few that will. And that's one of the reasons Ms. Colbert mentioned, and we have it in this blue box here too, is that regardless of how great of a tester you are, or if you're like, I just know, like in my gut, I'm not gonna get a good score, we do recommend you just take at least one, an ACT or an SAT, because down the line, if you fall in love with a school that happens to be one of the small number that are test required, at least you're able to submit a score, right? So we do recommend that you do that. So that leads us into kind of testing tips. And I should start out with, I apologize for those who maybe are newer to this. The two college entrance exams are the ACT and the SAT. The SAT is done through College Board. Most of the students know College Board, especially in this room. They run our AP test as well, PSAT, all those good things. And ACT is the ACT organization. So there are 2 options. I'm gonna have a next slide, that's gonna show the difference between the 2. So that's always a good question. So as far as just general testing tips, we generally, if you haven't already taken a test, we recommend, it's not too late. A lot of times people think, oh my gosh, I haven't done this yet. Generally, our recommendation in the counseling office is spring of your junior year. One of the reasons being, by the spring of your junior year, we can confidently say, you've received all of the academic preparation in classes for the test content, right? So I know some people do take it earlier depending on the track you're on, but we know for sure by that time you've gotten everything you need in order to, kind of hopefully be successful on the test, right? We can't know what to do with it, but at least you got the info, right? We recommend going to the test you're stronger with and prefer. You're gonna wanna register early. I have links in the next slide as well for where you register for those. It's just through SAT and ACT. Usually closes 1 month in advance. At the end of the presentation, you'll see we're gonna advertise the SAT is being hosted in March at Chatham, if you're interested in getting on that list. Oh yes.
Yeah, I just want to clarify by registering early. Registering early meaning once you identify the test date that you want to take that particular exam, register in advance of that test date because they fill up fast. Just to clarify, that doesn't mean register for a test right now, early, start testing now. We sometimes do find that some people start the testing timeline a little bit too early. Maybe the scores don't shake out exactly as they would hope in the beginning, which can then lead to over-testing. There is actually such a thing. You can become kind of saturated with that. So actually taking the time to really prepare, maybe take some practice tests in each to determine, which test is your test, the one that you think that you will be the most successful on, and then plan out a timeline. And we stand by our timeline of spring and junior year and beyond. Both testing agencies offer quite a few opportunities for test administrations, even into the summer and early fall. So there's really time to do the test.
Yeah, to that point, over-testing is a real thing. That's the last bullet I'll say on this slide. You usually see a marginal, a remarkable increase depending on who you are between your first test to your second test, but anything after that usually is pretty marginal. You're not seeing a huge change. It's a pretty small increase. So, going for more tests doesn't always mean is always the right thing to do, but just something to keep in mind. So, to what Mrs. Colbert just mentioned, so on the left side you'll see when the tests are offered. So, randomly, I don't know how did the SAT and ACT get together and choose what month they could have and they can share, I don't know, but there are certain months in which the SAT is offered and when the ACT is offered, right? So you can't just think, oh, I'm gonna take the SAT in February. You will not, there is none that exists, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then this on the right side is basically just a breakdown of the ACT versus the SAT. They are very similar. The biggest difference is the ACT has a science section. And you don't have to be, a master chemist in order to take the science section. A lot of it is graphs, data interpretation, things along those lines. But the very reason to this, being into what Mrs. Colbert's point was earlier, that, maybe you take a couple practice online, or maybe you just know, like I know for myself, ACT, I'm not a science person. That's why I'm on the stage, right? And so I took the SAT, right? It's just something I knew about myself. But it doesn't hurt to try those 2 different things. But these are basically the biggest questions of when are they offered and what are the 2 major differences.
Okay, college funding, not the most favorite topic of the evening. As a parent of a college graduate, oh my goodness, and another child who's about to go into college this coming fall, I can tell you that even though this is not the favorite topic, it is one that is very, very important. And having gone through the process now as a parent, I can tell you that it's so imperative that you sit down and have very real conversations ahead of time, during, and involved in the application process before you officially, submit applications, and have your child be well aware of what's possible and what isn't. We were very real with our children about what they could or couldn't do, what the parameters would be around that, how it would look, so that they wouldn't have difficult or disappointing decisions later on when the financial aid packages were in front of us. So it's never too early to start this conversation. Talk about what you realistically can do, whether or not you are open to considering loans for the portion of the college cost that you may not be able to fully cover, and certainly talk about the financial aid forms that you may need to fill out. We will speak to this in the junior conference in depth, as well as in the senior conference, and in the fall there will be a night devoted to college funding, so there will be an opportunity to get all the nuanced and important information on the FAFSA, which is the federal aid form, and the CSS profile, which is another form that most of the private institutions use. So you will be encouraged to fill those out, because they will sometimes lead you to other sources of aid that you would not be eligible for unless you filled those forms out. So the message here is really to be very mindful about college funding. It is expensive, and to have those real and relatable conversations as a family, and to ask a lot of questions about what the resources are for college funding, and that way there won't be any surprises later on.
Yeah, one of the more helpful tools out there, actually many years ago, a law was put in place where every college is required to have what is called a net price calculator. That's the blue box on the right side there. You can find it through the government site for just net price calculator. If you just Google it, and you can find each school, or you can go through the schools to do so. It's not perfect, right? But if you're going to enter in some financial information about yourself, sometimes, depending on the school, you can enter in GPA or grades, and they can give you an idea of like, oh, we generally give a student a scholarship for this GPA or things along those lines. So that's an excellent way to kind of manage and kind of manage your expectations in that regard for finances. So just to give you all a check on where we're at, we're going to go through just a few slides on Naviance. We're not going to focus on screenshots, and I'll tell you why in just a second. Number one, because you can't always see them from where you all are at, but also we have a lot of videos online to help with that. And then we're also going to then just talk about some upcoming events, some to do, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions, but just to give you an idea of where we're at. I know it's a long night, it's a lot of information. Like we were saying in the beginning, it's so much, but again, this is recorded, and we have a lot of resources to still help you throughout. Again, it's only January 4th, so we have a lot of time. So Naviance Student, if you're not familiar, is our college and career planning site. You can find out on our website, the website right there, or directly through the Chatham High School website. So Naviance can do a lot of things for you. As juniors, probably what you're doing is using it to help build your college list and college search. When you're a senior, you're going to be using it for requesting and submitting application documents, so don't even worry about that, but it does exist. And there are some really great career exploration tools on there. There are great opportunities to take like interest inventories and things along those lines. If you really don't know what you want to do, because hey, when I was in high school, I tell a lot of students this, I was going to be a lawyer, and this is not a courtroom. This is maybe the closest to like a judge. I don't have a gavel, but it's not even close, right? And things change. So those career exploration and assessments were helpful. School counselor came up in my career assessment and exploration, and when I was in high school, but I just didn't listen to it, right? So they can be really helpful. There's a resume tool that is available as well to help kind of start building a resume, to kind of organize the things that maybe you have been doing over the years. And then also if a parent is interested or a guardian is interested in an account, we can set that up for you. That's something you just need to reach out to me about. You can't kind of do it on your own at this point. So I want to highlight that on our college and career site, we have a whole Naviance section that goes over kind of what Naviance can do for you. And we included these 4 videos last year about how to do a college search on there, how to work with the colleges I'm thinking about list. So they're quick, like 4-minute videos, so you don't have to go through a whole nother presentation to kind of see it all, but that is an option on there, just so you're aware. So, data for list building and managing expectations, like I said, we want to give you the information. We also want to give you tools for how to do that, right, and managing those expectations. So there's a tool called Scattergrams, which we're going to show you an example of in the next slide. You may have heard this before, a lot of seniors talk about it. It's under the admissions panel on the college page, and essentially it's going to be graphing what the outcomes of Chatham High School students have been over the past years. We also have a tool, admitted student profiles, right? Not every college reports this, but a lot of colleges will report their admitted student profile. The example on the bottom here is Quinnipiac University. They post their class of 2026 profile. They're pretty straightforward with their GPA and test scores, how many applications they got. I think this is a super, super helpful metric. I put here just Google college name plus admitted student profile, because I think information you're gonna get about Chatham students is helpful, right? But you wanna also see what's happening nationally with students as well. So you might see average students from Chatham High School were admitted with, let's say, a 3.9 GPA, but maybe nationally the average was about a 3.5 GPA, right? So it can help kind of with your range and understanding. Scattergrams have limitations, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Or no, I have it right here, we're gonna talk about in this slide. It has limitations, right, and things to keep in mind. Scattergrams, which is the case for any college or career tool at this point, doesn't have an ability for us to filter if a student was test optional or not, right? So you may see a student plotted with your exact GPA for, I'll say Bucknell again, but maybe we don't know if they submitted their test score or if they didn't, right? So that's something to keep in mind. As well as student specifics, maybe if a student was an athlete, right? And as we've been saying this whole night, you never know what college metrics they're looking for, right? That's gonna change outcome every year, right? It's something we can't control. The other thing with scattergrams, which is why I also mentioned to double check your work kind of with the admitted student profile, is the scattergrams are only going to show Chatham students that have applied, right? So a scattergram may paint this picture that a student with a 3.5 can't get into this school, when the reality is maybe a student with a 3.5 has never applied to the school from Chatham High School, right? So we don't want to, that's why it's important to double check your work, as I say, with those admitted student profiles. Every once in a while, I'll search that for a school, and I get very frustrated because they don't have one, but a good amount of schools do have this, or these are questions you can ask an admissions counselor.
I'll just add really quick on that
Yeah.
point, is to just keep in mind too that the scattergram data and the middle 50% that the schools report, nationally on their sites, definitely very helpful information, but keep in mind it is a benchmark. It is not gospel. It is not the sole thing that you gauge whether or not that school is definitively in the target, reach, or likely category for you. Consider that there will be all the other components of the application considered in the review. This is just a way to kind of give that gauge as to where it falls.
Absolutely, it's always a great reminder. So here are two scattergram examples here, obviously one for every school, and they can be incredibly helpful. We just say those limitations to just be realistic, right? We don't want people to go in with, yeah, but the scattergram said this. Okay, but there's some limitations to those scattergrams. So we have two schools here, Drexel, which is a very favorable, happy scattergram, right? Lots of green. So there will be on the actual screen, I just took screenshots here, there will be a legend that's gonna tell you what all of those different things. As you see, BC has a couple more colors here. So Drexel, we've had really favorable outcomes. It is going to plot you as a student. So this is my student in this little blue here. This is my student down here for BC. One important thing to note is it's going to plot the test score that we have on file for you. So if you haven't taken a test score yet, it's not going to plot you, but you can self-plot yourself, I promise. It does work with the GPA kind of, and maybe an idea of where your range is potentially. So at Drexel, right, that's maybe a likely school for me. I'm right on kind of target with them. There might be some other factors I have to keep in mind for identifying it potentially as a target, major, all these different types of things, right? But that's a really favorable scattergram. Versus our Boston College scattergram, which isn't as so much, right? You're surrounded by some red X's, which are denials. There's some blue, which are actually students that were off of the wait list. So these are just metrics and tools to keep in mind when you're thinking about building your healthy list, identifying managing expectations. I'm going to dream of managing expectations tonight, I think, as I sleep, because I said it a million times. But these are just examples of kind of a happy scattergram, like I said, and a scattergram that maybe will cause you a little bit of pause, depending on where you're at. All right, so reiterate the idea that we have a really great resource online. It's our college and career website. So it's basically meant to be a virtual A110, which is our college and career office. and there are a ton of resources on there. I've highlighted on the right side, we have an entire section for junior forms and resources. So that Google form, that brag sheet that we talked about, every counselor's brag sheet is on there that you can fill out. So you'll fill out Ms. Coulbert's if she's yours. And then there's a lot of other forms and resources on there, including a junior conference checklist, so how to prepare for your junior conference. There's gonna be a junior just task list, which has the reminder about brag sheets and all those types of things. So a lot of good stuff. In our college search section, I think it has like 6 or 8 subcategories on there, right? So there's a lot of different stuff about visiting, building, all the stuff we basically talked about tonight, and then some on there as well, financial aid, college funding, all that good stuff. So you can access it there. We have a video library on there, so that's where this presentation will end up being. We will send it out so you can see it, but it will be accessible on there as well.
I encourage both parents and students to be in this site actively from this point forward. As we've highlighted, there's so much information here. When you're in doubt, in the evening and you can't, get immediate responses from us, go onto this site. And if you go to this menu of options and find your question under that category that, you're looking for a specific piece of information, I can almost guarantee that you're going to find it here. So this site is going to be your best friend between now all the way through to the fall.
All right, just a couple. Oh, I think I got So just a couple upcoming events. My microphone was done. It's ready for sleep. Was that we have the New Jersey NACAC, so that's the National Association of College Admission Counselors. That is a very reputable site. They're NACAC, you might hear that acronym a bunch. Any site, things along those lines, those are excellent. NACAC they have a New Jersey fair. The location is TBD, but it is in person. Usually it's at the Meadowlands. I heard a rumor it's in Edison this year, so we'll keep you updated. We are going to be having a college program this probably spring, potentially March as well, that will likely feature admission counselors or things along those lines, admission trends, just to kind of keep an update on what's kind of going on. You'll get plenty of emails in school as you post about that. And again, we're hosting the SAT at Chatham High School. And then you can see there's a bunch of virtual college fairs too if you're not able to get out to those as well. All right, so Ms. Coulbert is going to wrap up some of the future to-do pieces here.
Okay, so just continue to really think carefully about your potential goals, your actual goals, and start, getting that down on paper, thinking about how you're going to articulate that to your school counselor and on your brag sheet. Make sure you keep Naviance up to date. Mostly we're going to be in the colleges I'm thinking about list. And, that could be edited along the way. That list is fluid. It doesn't commit you to applying to those schools, but the more information we have in there about what you're thinking about, the more actively prepared we can be for your meeting. Make sure you schedule your junior conference in the parent portal. Students, please start filling out your game plans for us so that we can have that information in advance of the conference, even though you'll get reminders ahead of time. As we said, maybe start thinking about a standardized test timeline. And in May, we will have reminders about the due dates for the student brag sheet that we spoke about earlier. And parents, there'll be a little homework assignment for you called the Senior Parent Questionnaire. This is also extremely helpful to us as school counselors in terms of getting some additional information that personalizes your student's story so that we can emphasize some of those key points in our letters of recommendation. And then looking ahead to the summer, although right now you're going to be conducting the research phase of the process, there will be parts of our conference that will prepare you for things that you need to start doing over the summer and into the early fall to prepare for the application process itself, namely securing letters of recommendation, at least the request for teachers to write one for you. That will be wrapped up in the spring time frame. Beginning to work on your essay, just getting a draft going that you can continue to work on over the summer months. And then the Common App usually and most other application platforms or the schools themselves will open up shortly after August 1, meaning that you can just get a little bit of a jump start on filling them out. It is a time-consuming process. Don't rush it. And Mrs. Slate will be providing a lot of information to our rising seniors through the latter part of the year and into the summer months and early fall that will give you a roadmap to all of this.
Yes, absolutely. This is not the last point of contact you will have with your counselor, especially with myself. Your poor students, I apologize for spamming your inbox. The seniors and I joke all the time that, yeah, just another email from Bisley. But this will not be the last point of contact, right? There's a lot for us to support you through this process. And we'll continue to have these conversations throughout and support you throughout the process. It really, we know it can feel like a lot, and the reality is it is a lot, right? When it comes to planning life after Chatham, whatever that looks like for you, but also this college application process. But we are confident over the last couple of years, this is my 5th year here, that we have a lot of great resources available to help you every step of the way with that process. And so maybe it feels initially very, very overwhelming, but we'll really break those down into chunks for you to help make it as less painful as possible. And it is a really exciting time. I mean, I always say the older you get, the less opportunities you have to do all these cool, exciting things, to go visit schools, to potentially go to a great school in maybe a different state or things along those lines. So we said a little bit, a portion earlier of, try to be present as much as possible, enjoy the process, and realize, it is an exciting process. So, being cognizant of the time, we do have a couple minutes for questions. If people do have questions, of course, email or things along those lines, we're always happy to do. Your junior conference is going to come up, or those specific types of questions that we're going to ask you keep to your, for yourself or maybe your junior conference, or email. So any kind of general questions, clarification maybe on the essay, clarification on the presentation. Oh, it looks like Mr. Henderson has a microphone. Beautiful, yeah, okay.
Yes, if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand, and Mrs. Durando or I will bring a microphone over to you.
That is also fine. That is a sign of a very thorough presentation. No, okay, go ahead.
So if your child is applying for a summer program and it's already started working on the essay, it's due on January 15th. So how does that work with, can I have the counselor go through the essay because it's too early for him, but still we need to do it?
So the question was in regards to the summer programs, and actually that's a great point to bring up. So some students do like to take advantage of the summer opportunity for maybe college prep or just college experience, or there's a slew of career-based ones, and actually in the next couple of weeks we'll be sending out, we have a summer program database. It's an Excel sheet with different categories of topics of just like where you can find different, so if you're interested in the STEM, you can find different STEM-related summer programs and things along those lines. So, as we hit January and it gets a little chillier, we can start thinking about those fun summer months. So that's a shameless plug for that. That will be coming out through School Messenger and stuff for individuals on Schoology. But in regards to the essay, so for some summer programs, there might be an essay component or things along those lines for acceptance for that. Depending on counselor's availability, that could be something to definitely take a look at individually. It's a part of the process, right? But we do also have a writing lab that is during the lunch period that is always staffed with English teachers. It's in the A-Wing, and so students can also always go there. We had a lot of students bring their college essays there. They could hear from Mr. Ferg or Ms. Reed or Ms. Fallon about getting some feedback on that as well. So if counselors aren't as available, because with scheduling and junior conferences, that's also a really great option for students for essay support too.
Hi, I just had a quick question on international colleges. So, and I'm sure you get a small percentage that look at the UK and Europe. What kind of support is there and insight?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually are getting more and more students looking to go to school internationally. It's very much an opportunity for students and something that every counselor actually at this point has had experience with advising students on, including myself. So usually that's a bit more of a nuanced conversation rather than kind of this general presentation, especially the UK. UCAS system is very, very nuanced and they have very specific expectations, but the support is just the same as the support for the domestic process exists for the international process. It might take a couple extra little steps in contacting, UK schools and things along those lines, but we absolutely will support students and have supported students through the UK international process.
We can have more personalized conversations within the conference itself about, those goals and plans, if that's something that you're looking to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time in your evening to come on out and talk with us about all of this. Take a deep breath. You're already taking the next step and really putting your best foot forward for this process, and we'll be here throughout the process to get you going.
I promise you, you will survive the process. Take it slow. It can be really fun and enjoyable if you just, move through it slowly, do the active research that I was talking about, and I promise you, you will all land where you're supposed to be ultimately. Have a good night, everybody.